welcome to Thursday's East Side. We are going to go ahead and let Ronnie take it away. Ronnie.
Thank you. I had asked Rebecca if I could go first because I'm not feeling well. So I am going to talk about the 90s fashion, and then I am going to log out and leave you all to yourselves to finish up. But the 90s is a fun decade. So let me share my screen with you all. Oh, undisable Rebecca. Okay.
You got it?
Yep. Thank you. So welcome to the 1990s. This is a fun decade. It's more optimistic. The United States and the United Kingdom, or England, had replaced their sort of boring, conservative, old white men presidents and prime minister. We had Ronald Reagan, and they had, oh my gosh, I just forgot his name. Margaret Thatcher. And they were sort of older fuddy-duddies. And so in the 90s, we got Bill Clinton and Tony Blair. And they were sort of like younger, fun, hip. And so the countries were ready sort of to just have some fun. The environmental movement really got going. It was all about fun and happy. You had Friends, the show. I bet you a lot of you have seen it because it's on Netflix and it's a good show. The Spice Girls were there, and they were all about bright colors and fun, catchy, poppy stuff. It was sort of also a backlash to that 80s idea of greed is good, and it's all about how much money you can make, how wealthy you can appear. It was all about the elites. And now it's more, people wanted real. TV shows that were super popular were about real families. Like you had the Roseanne Barr show, and that was about a middle or like lower class working blue collar family. And you had even the first reality show, The Real World, came on. And so people didn't want to watch shows like Dynasty and Dallas like they did in the 80s that were all about wealthy people. They wanted to watch about real people. And so that wasn't about being glamorous. It was sort of the decade of the losers. Here we have, just like we've seen before, where a certain place takes on significance in the before we had Paris obsession. It was all about New York in the 70s. So in the 90s, it's all about Seattle, and especially the grunge scene for music. Because we're so close, I bet all of you know that Starbucks started in Seattle. There were shows like Frasier on, and of course, Sleepless in Seattle is one of the best, like, sort of romance 90s style movies. Our first style icon, Kurt Cobain. This look of sort of long, sort of stringy, scruffy face, the flannels with, usually there's a band t-shirt underneath, ripped jeans. This was the look for the 90s, especially. It was such a perfect Pacific Northwest look because it gets cold. And so it started out as just necessity, and people were thrift shopping, which hadn't been popular before. So they were just wearing kind of loose, baggy clothes. And then it expanded all across the world, this grunge look. It was again, like a backlash against that high fashion look. Definitely against that new romantics, culture club, Boy George look. 90s guys didn't really wear makeup. Our body ideal, we had two different sort of body ideals, that heroin chic. This is where your super skinny models start coming in. Kate Moss was a perfect example of that. And Courtney Love, who was married to Kurt Cobain from Nirvana. And seriously, I think she did it. So there's a whole documentary on a conspiracy theory and accusing her of killing Kurt Cobain. So you have this heroin chic where it's like really sunken in cheeks, collarbones are really exposed and showing, lots of ribs showing. Then you have your supermodels, which was the ideal that 99.9% of people could not achieve. But they became celebrities in themselves just for being supermodels. Here's another of that heroin chic look. It's like you went clubbing all night and you are coming home the next day, smeared makeup, sort of smeared lipstick even, very, very thin. The appeal was like she was the kind of girl that could party all night long, and she was sort of hardcore, and she was like the cool girl. Then you have rave culture, which is super fun too. It was sort of, you had grunge, which was very angsty and all about, you know, your deep, intense feelings. And then you have rave, which was that electronica beat, and it was for dancing and it was for just having fun. There was also a lot of drugs on the scene. But look at all like these necklaces they've got piled on and on and on and on. Fashion also became more about art. So a lot of designers weren't creating collections that were really intended to be worn on the street. They were intended to be a statement or a message or a concept. So if you had an idea in your head and you wanted to turn that idea into clothing, it was all about the concept. So you would not be wearing or could not be wearing these going down the street, but the designer who created this had an idea in mind and wanted to make it three-dimensional. So it was just meant to be thought-provoking or beautiful, but definitely not wearable. There is still a little bit of that elite status symbol that sneaked through from the 80s, but most people could not afford an outfit by Gucci, Chanel, or Dior, any of those really high luxury brands. But you could potentially afford one of their handbags. So one of the most iconic, which I don't have a picture on here, is the like Louis Vuitton bags with their logo all over it. And so women who couldn't afford anything else, but they could afford like this one special thing, and it definitely was a status symbol. You made sure that everybody knew this was a Louis bag or this was a Coach bag. Like you had to make sure that people knew that it was that brand name, because the brand name really matters to some people. It would just became a status symbol. Your mainstream 90s look, here, how boring can you possibly get? But this was sort of the staple of teenagers in early 20s, jeans, t-shirts. But you'll notice for a lot of them, the jeans are rolled up. That was like a popular look too. This is kind of just what everyday people wore. Then you've got more of your mainstream look from Friends, and this haircut known as the Rachel. I had the Rachel. Everybody I knew had the Rachel. But these short skirts, you see, if you were in my class on Tuesday, I had my t-shirt with my spaghetti strap tank top over the top. Spaghetti straps were big. Overalls, very popular. And sweaters and short skirts. If you've ever seen the movie Clueless, that is a great embodiment of 90s outfits. There's also, if you're in any of my classes on Google Classroom, I posted a fun kind of Miss Mojo video of some more 90s trends because couldn't fit them all on here. As usual, thank you to the Ultimate Fashion History channel on YouTube. She's got more on there, but if it tells you a little bit about the 90s that there wasn't as much as there have been in previous decades, that her previous videos are like an hour and a half long, or sometimes two of those. Her 90s video was only like 30 minutes long. So not as much cutting edge stuff going on. So anyway, before I leave, does anybody have any questions for me regarding specifically 90s fashion? No? Okay. All right.
Feel better, Ronnie.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I just want to write down anybody else that
I'll keep up.
I didn't. Yeah. Thank you, guys. Bye.
Tobias, you want to go or you want me to go?
Sure, I can go.
All right.
So Ronnie actually made it nice for me because she talked about grunge and rave, which kind of tie into what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to share my screen if I can. Let's do this. Okay. So what we see, if we think about where we came from with the 80s, what we see in the 90s is like kids who grew up with MTV as a normal thing. And we end up seeing kind of this first wave of pop stars. Now, maybe they existed in different capacities throughout the other decades, but this was like a generation that grew up as kids who became kid pop stars, adult pop stars, and it was like this whole thing. So we have like the Spice Girls, NSYNC, the Backstreet Boys, Britney Spears, Christina Aguilera, Destiny's Child. They were all like younger, growing up in this visual pop star world, and it just became kind of a normal thing. That like it didn't mean that they totally understood they couldn't just be focused on the music. They had to also be focused on the visual side, the dancing side, the lifestyle side, etc. So we have that. Then Ronnie already touched on grunge, which came out of the Northwest, specifically Seattle. So we have Nirvana and Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden. Now, I guess what I would say is if we kind of look back on these other decades, there was protest music, there was rock and roll. This was like a combination of a lot of those together. It kind of showed up in like a darker way. It definitely had a lot of things to say. It was a movement that was certainly focused on content and not just flashy lights. But it was presented in a much more maybe like low-key manner than maybe like metal or aggressive rock. So I guess we would call it either grunge or alt rock. This term alternative rock started getting tossed around, which really just meant kind of rock and roll and folk music, and kind of a hybrid of the two came together. And then of course we have hip hop. So the two things that I really want to touch on are going to be kind of combined. And if you watched my video for the week, I won't go as deep as I did there, but I want to point out one of my favorite topics, which is, let's go to this page here. So this is the first time in like the late 80s and the early 90s. It's the very first time that technology for music became replaced and obsolete. So like the technology that came out in the 70s and the early 80s, about 10 years later becomes old school. And that meant it became cheaper. And it's the very first time that this happens, because all the equipment before that was not really consumer based. It wasn't accessible in that way. So this is probably, I mean, quite frankly, my favorite thing to talk about, because what I think is most amazing about how hip hop started and how house music started and techno started, it's because people who didn't have a lot of money went out and bought this gear that was finally accessible because it was on the used market. So they would buy it at a pawn shop, or they would buy it used on through the newspaper. This is before the internet. And they would get their hands on this equipment for the very first time. And people who originally owned it, they had no idea what it was capable of doing, what that stuff was meaning. So we're talking about drum machines and samplers and things that were kind of intended for a different purpose, were repurposed and turned into these tools that started an entirely new wave of music. And so in Detroit and in Chicago, we see really kind of this birth of electronic music. So it's going to be Chicago house music and techno music in Detroit. And it's a lot of what Ronnie showed, where it's like there were raves behind it, but it was also just the idea that you were going to, the term house music actually came from warehouse music. They would go to these abandoned warehouses with these big sound systems, and they would put on these big dance parties and these raves, and it got shortened to house music. But it was all because people were using affordable equipment to do whatever they could with it. It was like making the best with what they had, and it literally kind of was the birth of something brand new, which I think is super incredible to think like we're in this day and age where we now have access to a lot of that stuff. We have access to a lot of tools, even if it's just software. And I get really inspired thinking about you guys as students and what that means for the future of music, because I think maybe in the last 20 years, we have more access to this technology than we ever have before. And that means you guys have the power to create something brand new and something amazing that didn't exist with the same tools before. So I don't know, I get really inspired about that. But these other photos were just like, you can see this technology. I mean, we look at it even now, it looks ancient, but the technology then wasn't cutting edge, but this music was made on some of this, you know, these old drum machines, the old recording systems, old mixers. And I just grabbed a couple shots off the internet. But hip hop is the same thing. So hip hop started in New York, and then it eventually worked its way to the West Coast. So you see two different kind of schools of thought. One definitely has the New York East Coast vibe, and then the other was more on the West Coast vibe. And eventually, probably by the late 90s, we see them merge a lot more. But when they first started in kind of the late 80s, early 90s, there was two schools. And then nowadays, obviously, like it's just all over the place. But yeah, that's the 90s in a nutshell. And if you're interested further, I can share the other video, which I go in a lot more depth about the equipment and that kind of stuff. So let me check to see if there are questions. I'm gonna stop sharing. Okay, that's it for me.
That's a great segue for mine. As you mentioned, right, that technology is in the homes, people are using it more and more. We get the rise of digital artwork from that. Right. So this is our first person who really kind of pioneered, Manfred here. He really took it into using algorithms and the computers to start writing and doing digital art. It's very, very bland at first, you know, definitely looks very simplistic and 90s and kind of ancient, right? But it starts to move up. Joseph here is our first person to have artificial intelligence start writing the programs and completing the artwork itself. Very digitalized, you know, very early 90s computer look, right? Peter. Right? Very, very digital, but this is the first time that we have like artificial intelligence start to complete artwork on its own. So George here is my favorite out of the 90s. There's some good discussion on Tuesday with my art students on him. Really looking at, yeah, it is amazing how everything ties together. Really starting to take our artwork that is digital and take it to the next step and start adding in layers, really brought in the fantasy realm, really takes it and runs with it. Yeah, these are some amazing kind of fantasy pieces that came out of that time period. Like this one here with the face. Okay. We also get a giant rise in street art becoming more accepted and public and sought after. Shepard Fairey here is a really big street artist, designer, graphic designer, right? You'll know his works when we get to it, but here's like some of his earlier stuff. Michael, please stop drawing on my stuff. Great. This is Andre the Giant. If you've seen Princess Bride, he is the giant in that. He was also an amazing wrestler. He also did Obama's Hope posters and campaign. Mission for those. And the We the People. Out of the 90s, we get Banksy. So if you've never heard of Banksy, he is a English-based street artist. He does not ask for permission. You should always make sure you are asking for permission. Always. But because he did not ask for permission, he basically started inventing stenciling and using stencils in graffiti artwork because he had to spray it, get in, and get out real fast. This is one of his recent ones, Santa Claus here. Also a giant rise of Keith Haring. It was funny, I went to Target on Wednesday, and for the 4th of July was one of his prints on one of the shirts that you could buy for the 4th of July line from Target this year.
Oh, those.
Yep, both, as Ashton says, oh, those, that guy. Yep, came big out of the 90s. It was a big activist, spoke a lot on, rights, the AIDS epidemic, really tried to speak to what was going on at the decade. So those are little really quick happenings of the 90s and what was going on with the art at the time. Anybody have any thoughts, questions? Now's the portion.
Which one of the artists is your favorite? The ones that you've shown today. Which one's your favorite?
Banksy.
Fair enough.
I love Banksy. I love what he stands for. I love his art style. I loved it when he shredded his piece of artwork at auction.
Nice.
He's amazing. My Tuesday class saw a video where he had just donated, dropped off a piece of artwork at a hospital with a basket of toys and a kid playing with a basket of toys, and all the superheroes are in the basket, and he's playing with the nurse as the superhero. I just love what he does.
Wow, that's amazing. That's truly amazing.
Anything else? That's a wrap on our 90s, guys.
Nice.
I love that how he shredded his own piece of artwork because he won't let it sell for money.
Because he doesn't believe in selling his stuff for money. Yep.